The night Maeve Aldercroft stepped over the corpse pit rope at Iron Fang, the executioner's axe was already lifted. The dawn was already bleeding pink against the iron battlements, and the only living thing in the courtyard who recognized her for what she truly was had 4 legs and a mouthful of 3 trainers' blood. She did not know yet that the man watching from the wall above, the king with the wolf-bright eyes and the scar that bisected his jaw, would within a single moon cycle break a 1,000-year custom for her sake. She did not know that the polished cousin who stood at his shoulder, all silver braid and courtly smile, was already counting the hours until she would be silenced. She knew only that the great black stallion in the pit was screaming a grief so loud she could feel it in her teeth, and that no one in the gathered crowd of soldiers, stable hands, and gawking nobles seemed able to hear it. They saw a feral beast. They saw frothing jaws and rolling eyes and 3 dead men in the straw. They did not see what she saw, which was a creature kneeling inside its own mind, beside a body it could no longer find. The cold of the flagstones bit through her thin slippers. Her breath came in white tufts. Somewhere behind her, Cook Sharon was hissing her name and trying to drag her back by the apron strings, and somewhere ahead of her, Beta Master Garrick had already roared the order to strike. And Maeve, who at 16 had been marked rejected because her first shift never came, who had been called broken and scent blind and lesser for the 7 years since, who had survived the Iron Fang stronghold by scrubbing pots until her knuckles split and by speaking to no one and asking for nothing, walked across the frozen yard and put her bare hand on the bloodied muzzle of King Torvin's warhorse. The stallion did not bite her. The stallion exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that smelled of copper and hay and something else underneath, something old and inconsolable, and lowered his enormous head until his forelock brushed her wrist. The axe did not fall. The crowd did not move. Maeve, whose voice in 7 years had rarely risen above the murmur required to ask for the salt, lifted her face toward the wall where the king stood and said, clearly enough that every soul in that courtyard heard her, that the horse was not feral. The horse was mourning. And the horse could still smell, on someone walking these halls, the man who had killed his rider. What she did not know, what no one in that yard yet knew, was that the polished cousin standing at the king's right shoulder had gone, in that exact instant, the precise shade of bone. Torvin had been awake since the 3rd bell. He had not slept properly in the 11 months since his brother Cale had ridden out at the head of the mounted guard and come back across his own saddle, with a crossbow bolt in his throat, and his honor guard slaughtered to the last man, save the horse beneath him, who had carried him home and then refused to let any living soul touch the body, until Torvin himself had lifted his brother down. That horse, Vasker, had since killed 2 grooms, maimed a 3rd, savaged the undermarshal, and now, this dawn, gored a man named Edrin so badly that Edrin's wife was being held upright in the kitchens by 2 of her sisters. Torvin had given the order with the taste of ash in his mouth. Vasker was the last thing in the world that had loved Cale, and Torvin had been about to put a blade through that love because the council had decreed it, and because his beta master had sworn the beast was past saving. Then a girl in a flower-streaked apron had walked across his courtyard as if death held no meaning, had touched a stallion that had killed 3 men, and had told him, in front of his entire court, that he had been wrong. He felt the wolf inside him stand up, the wolf, who had been silent and grieving for 11 months, lifted its head and said, in a voice quite distinct from his own, "That one." Torvin leaned his palms against the parapet stone. He had no idea what his face was doing. He looked at the girl, at the impossibly thin shoulders under the apron, at the dark plait coming loose at her nape, at the small reddened hands resting on the muzzle of a creature that should, by every law of nature, have torn her open, He looked at his cousin Garrick beside him, the beta master, who had gone white. He looked at his other cousin, Lord Regent Castaigne, who had gone whiter. And Torvin, King of Ironfang, raised his hand and stopped the dawn. He came down into the yard himself. Men did not part for him so much as fall away, the way water falls away from a thrown stone. And Maeve felt the change in the air before she saw him, the way a kitchen feels when someone opens an outside door in winter. She did not turn. She kept her hand where it was on the stallion's muzzle, because Vasker's eye was still rolling, and his breath was still coming too fast, and she could feel under her palm the place where grief had become a sound he could no longer stop making. Torvin stopped a horse length from her. She had never been this close to him. She had served at the long table on feast nights, of course, kept her head down, refilled wine pitchers, vanished. She had a memory of him as a shape, a low voice, a hand passing a cup. She had not known he was so tall. She had not known he carried, in the air around him, the kind of stillness that other men spent their whole lives trying to fake. The beta master, Garrick, came down behind him, snarling under his breath about protocol, about the corpse pit rope, about a scullery girl putting hands on the king's animal. Torvin lifted one finger, and Garrick stopped speaking as cleanly as if a door had shut on his throat. Maeve risked a glance up. The king was looking at her, not at the horse, at her. His eyes were the color of wet slate, and they were doing something she could not read, because of course she could not read it, because she could not scent him, could not feel the prickle of pack presence that other wolves felt around their king, could feel only the great mourning animal under her hand and the cold flagstones under her feet, and her own pulse going far too fast in her throat. "Speak again," Torvin said. His voice was lower than she remembered. "Tell me what you told the wall." Maeve swallowed. Cook Sharon, somewhere behind the rope, was making a noise like a kettle. The crowd had not dispersed. Maeve had spent 7 years being invisible, and now she was the most visible thing in Ironfang, and the only way through it was to keep her hand on Vasker and to say the truth as plainly as she had said it the first time. "He is not feral, sire," she said. "He is grieving. Horses grieve. Most folk do not know it, because most folk do not stand still long enough to listen. He has been alone with what happened to your brother since the day he carried him home. He has not been allowed to mourn. He has been muzzled and chained and asked to forget. And he cannot forget, because horses do not forget. And there is something else." The wolf inside Torvin leaned forward. Maeve felt the king's attention sharpen the way a blade sharpens. She kept her eyes on Vasker's eye. "He smells someone," she said. "Someone who was there that day. Someone who is still inside these walls. He smells them every time they pass the stables, and he goes mad, because the only thing he has left of his rider is the memory of who took his rider away, and no one will follow him to the man. That is why he killed Idrin. Idrin walked him past the south corridor this morning. He was not aiming at Idrin. He was trying to get to whoever was in that corridor." Torvin did not move. Behind him, Lord Regent Castaigne laughed, a small, polished laugh, and said with great kindness that the child was clearly distressed, that grief in beasts was a poet's notion, that the horse was lame in the mind, and ought to be put down before he killed a fourth. Maeve did not look at Castaigne. She did not need to. She could feel under her hand the way Vasker's whole body went rigid at the sound of that polished laugh, the way his nostrils flared, the way the great muscle along his neck jumped as if struck by a goad. She felt the horse's grief become, in one heartbeat, fury. She tightened her grip on his muzzle. "Steady," she said very softly, "only for him, steady." He smelled the killer of his rider, and the killer of his rider was standing 6 paces from his king, smiling. Torvin, who had not moved, said without turning his head, "Cousin, step back." Castaigne stepped back. Vasker did not lunge because Maeve's hand was on him, and because some thread between them, the thread she could feel in animals the way other healers felt it in wounds, was holding. Torvin looked at Maeve for a long moment. He looked at the way her thin shoulders were set, at the blood on her sleeve from where Vasker's lip had split, at the absolute lack of fear in her face, and the wolf inside him said again, "That one, that one, that one." He said aloud, "Garrick, find a chamber adjoining the war room. The girl lodges there from this hour." He said to Maeve, "You have 1 cycle of the moon to prove what you have just told me. If at the end of that cycle the horse cannot be ridden by my hand, he dies. If you are lying, you die with him. Do you understand the contract?" Maeve nodded once. He said, more quietly, "What is your name?" She said, "Maeve." He said, "Maeve, do not let go of him until the yard is cleared." Then he turned, and the dawn moved again, and the axe was lowered, and Castaigne, smiling still, walked back into the keep the way a man walks who has not yet decided which knife to use. Her chamber adjoined the war room. There was a door between them. The door had a bolt on her side. She bolted it the first night and lay awake on a mattress that was thicker than any she had ever slept on in her life, listening to men's voices through the wall, recognizing none of the words, recognizing only the low rumble of the king's voice underneath the others. A rumble she could feel in the bones of the wall, as if the room itself had a pulse. She did not sleep. She got up at the kitchen hour out of habit, found that no one had assigned her work, found that cook Sharon, when she crept down to the kitchens, would not look at her. The other scullions had been told. Word had gone out. The broken Omega had touched the king's horse and lived, and was now in a chamber by the war room, and no one knew yet whether to spit at her or curtsy, and so they did neither, and that was almost worse. She took bread and went out to the stables before second bell. Vasker was in the largest box, alone. The doors of the boxes on either side of him standing empty, because no other horse would tolerate his proximity. He saw her and pinned his ears, then unpinned them. She climbed up onto the half door and sat there, eating her bread. And after a little while, he came over and put his great head on her knee, and she felt under her palm the inside of his morning, and she began to learn the shape of it. He had loved his rider very much. His rider had smelled like leather, and a particular smoke, and a particular sweat, and there had been a song his rider hummed, a low, repetitive song in 3 notes, and Vasker had carried that song in his ribs, the way other creatures carried lullabies. The day his rider had been taken away from him, there had been other smells. There had been crossbow oil. There had been a man who came too close, who smelled of a particular soap. A soap Vasker had smelled before in the courtyard, in the great hall, in the corridors of the keep. The smell of that soap was knotted in Vasker's mind with the smell of his rider's blood. Maeve sat with that knotted thing under her hand for a long time. She did not yet know what soap. She did not yet know whose. She knew only that whoever it was lived in this keep and walked freely in it and had been near the king again only yesterday. She thought of the polished cousin's polished laugh. She did not name him to herself yet. Naming a man without proof was the kind of mistake that ended girls like her. On the second day, Beta Master Garrick came to the stable. He was a square man with a square beard, and the kind of hands that had broken many things on purpose. He had been her enemy yesterday, and he was not yet her friend today. He stood with his arms folded and watched her sit on the half door. He said, eventually, that no one had ever told him a horse could grieve. He said it the way a man says something that has cost him to say. Maeve said, "Most folk do not, sir." He watched a while longer. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "Time." She said, "A pasture, not a yard." She said, "Permission to take him out at dawn, before the keep wakes, where there are no smells but grass." She said, "And, sir, with respect, I need to know who tended your brother on the day he died, who cleaned his armor, who dressed his body, who walked the horse home. I need every name, and I need to know what soap they use." Garrick stared at her. Then he barked a short laugh, not unkind, and said, "By the bones, girl," he said, "you shall have your list by nightfall." He kept his word. The list, when it came, was 12 names. One of the names was Castaigne's body servant, a man called Pell. Another of the names was Lord Regent Castaigne himself, who had insisted on personally seeing to the laying out of his cousin's body, out of love. May folded the list very small and put it inside her bodice. She did not tell Garrick what she suspected. She did not tell anyone. She walked Vasker out at dawn the next morning, into the upper pasture where the frost lay heavy on the grass, and the only smell in the air was earth, and she let him stand and breathe the smell that did not contain his grief. He put his forehead against her chest and stayed there. The king was watching from the gallery above. She did not know it. He watched, and the wolf inside him, who had not spoken in 11 months, would not now stop speaking. The wolf wanted to know why she did not look up at him. The wolf wanted to know why she did not flush, or preen, or angle herself toward him the way every other unmated woman in this stronghold did. The wolf wanted to know, with a kind of confused affront, why she could not feel him watching her. Torvin, who was a fair man and a careful one, did not yet allow himself to wonder the same thing. He came to the stable on the 4th day. She did not hear him come in because she was sitting in the straw with Vasker's head in her lap, telling the horse, in a low, even voice, the names of her dead. She had been doing this for 2 days. She had explained to Vasker, the first morning, that grief eased a little when the names of the lost were said aloud to someone who would not flinch from them, and that since no one had ever said his rider's name to him in the months since, she would say the names of her own lost first, to show him how it was done. So she had begun with her mother, who had died of fever in the winter she was 9. She had moved on to her father, who had not died, but had walked away when the rejection mark went on her at 16, which was a different kind of dying. She had named the cat that had slept on her feet in the scullery and been kicked to death by a drunk under-marshal. She had named the undercook who had been kind to her once. By the 4th day, she had reached the smaller griefs, the kitchen boy with the limp, the dog in the yard, the bird that had flown into the glass of the great hall and broken its neck on the stone, and Vasker was breathing slow and even in her lap. Torvin stood in the doorway and listened. He had not meant to listen. He had come to inspect, to lay his own hand on the animal, to satisfy the council that the king had not been bewitched by a scullery omega. He stood in the doorway and listened to a girl name a kitchen boy with a limp, as if the kitchen boy had mattered, and the wolf inside him made a sound he had never heard it make before, a soft, confused sound, almost a whine. He cleared his throat. Maeve did not startle. She turned her head, slowly, as one turned in the presence of a sleeping infant, and she said, "Sire." He came in. He knelt down in the straw, which a king did not do, which made Garrick at his shoulder go rigid. He put his hand, palm up, on the straw between himself and the horse. Vasker lifted his head from Maeve's lap and looked at the king for a long moment, and something passed between them that Torvin could not name, and Maeve could see plain as morning, because she could see these things, because that was what she was for. Vasker, after a long breath, lowered his muzzle into the king's open hand. Torvin made a sound. It was not a word. He bent his forehead to Vasker's, and Vasker stood very still under it. And Maeve, who could not scent the wolf in the man, could see, plain as morning, that the king was weeping without sound. She looked away, because some things were not for her. She busied herself with a buckle on the head collar that did not need busying. After a while, Torvin said, very quietly, "He has not let me touch him since Kale." Maeve said, "He was waiting, sire, to be told it was allowed." Torvin said, "Allowed." She said, "To grieve where you could see him. He has been hiding it. He thought he had to be useful. He thought you would not want him if he was broken." Torvin did not answer for a long time. When he did, his voice had gone strange. He said, "Where did you learn this?" Maeve said, "I do not know, sire. I have always heard them. Animals. I cannot hear wolves the way you do. I have never been able to scent another wolf. Not my mother, not my father, not the priestess who marked me rejected. I have been told all my life that I am the wrong shape of person. But I can hear what a horse remembers. I can hear what a dog dreams. I knew, before Cook Sharon told me, that the kitchen tabby was carrying kits. I knew, before the undermarshal told the yard, that his hound would not survive the winter. It is the only thing I have." He looked at her. He looked at her properly, for the first time, in the half-light of the stable, with straw in her hair and a horse's tear track on her sleeve, and the wolf inside him said, very clearly, "Ours." Torvin, who was a careful man, said nothing aloud. He stood. He said, "You will eat at the high table tonight." Maeve said very fast, "Sire, please, no." He said, "You will eat at the high table tonight, because if you continue to take your bread in the kitchens, my cousin will find a reason to put something in it." She went very still. He saw that she had already understood which cousin. He nodded once, as if a contract between them had been signed without words, and he walked out, and Garrick, lingering in the doorway, said under his breath, "Bones and stone, girl. What have you done to him?" Maeve, sitting in the straw, with Vasker's breath warm against her cheek, said, "Nothing, sir. He came in like that." She ate at the high table. She wore a dress that Cook Sharon, weeping, had altered from one of the old queen's mourning gowns, dark green wool with a high collar that hid the rejection mark on her throat. She sat 3 seats from the king, because the empty seat at his left hand was, by custom, the queen's, and the empty seat at his right hand was, by custom, the heir's. And Castaigne sat in the heir's seat, with his polished smile, and ate nothing he had not seen poured. Maeve did the same, without seeming to. She had spent 7 years in a kitchen. She knew which cup had been near which hand. She knew which bowl had been set down by which servant. She drank only from the pitcher Garrick himself filled, because Garrick, who had been her enemy on the first day, was now, by some shift she did not understand, sitting at her elbow, as if he had been posted there. The hall did not speak to her. The hall watched her. She felt the watching like a damp cloth on her back. Halfway through the meal, the Lady Frida of Hollowmere, who had been preparing since the age of 12 to be Torvin's queen, leaned across 2 seats and asked, in a voice pitched to Carrie, whether it was true that the scullery girl was sleeping in the war-room chamber, and whether anyone had thought to check her for fleas. The hall laughed. Maeve, who had spent 7 years being laughed at, did not flush. She lifted her eyes calmly to the Lady Frida and said, in a voice that did not shake, "Lady, the only fleas in Iron Fang are in the heir's chamber, because the heir's hound has not been treated in 3 months. I noticed, when his hound came begging at the kitchen door yesterday, that she has begun chewing her own tail. If the lady would permit me to attend her, I can have her comfortable by morning." The hall went quiet. Castaigne, in the heir's seat, smiled at Maeve. It was a smile she would remember. He said, "How charming. The girl who whispers to beasts. Tell me, child, do they whisper back?" Maeve said, "Yes, my lord. They tell me what they have smelled." Castaigne's smile did not move, but his hand, on the stem of his cup, went, for the briefest instant, very white. Torvin, at the head of the table, watched it happen and did not stop it. Beside Maeve, Garrick exhaled once through his nose, the way a man exhales when a trap has settled into place. After dinner, when she rose, she felt a hand at her elbow, and she turned, expecting Garrick, and found instead a small girl of perhaps 6, in a sleeping shift, with hair the color of new straw, holding by the collar a very fat, very anxious puppy. The child said, "You are the one who hears them." Maeve, kneeling, said, "Yes." The child said, "This is Brindle. I am Katie. I am the king's ward. My father was Cale." Maeve's breath caught. She put her hand on the puppy's forehead, and the puppy, who had been trembling, sighed and leaned into her. The child Katie said, "Brindle is sad. He misses my father too. Will you tell him my father went on a long ride, and the ride is taking longer than we thought?" Maeve, who would later understand that this moment was the one that had decided her, said, "I will tell him better than that. I will tell him your father loved him very much and will not be coming home, but that you are still here, and that he is your dog now, and that his job is to sleep at the foot of your bed and to be brave for you, and that this is a very important job, and that he has been promoted." The child Katie considered this gravely, then she nodded, with the absolute seriousness of small children about important matters, and she leaned up and kissed Maeve on the cheek. Maeve, who had not been kissed by a living thing since she was 9, did not weep. She held herself very straight. She walked Katie back to her chambers, and the puppy walked after, and they passed the king in the corridor, and the king watched them pass, and the wolf inside him, who had been an orphan for 11 months, said, "Ours, ours, ours, all of them, ours." That night, Torvin knocked on the door between the war room and her chamber. She unbolted it. He did not come in. He stood in the doorway. He said, "I sent the child to you." Maeve said, "I know." He said, "How?" She said, she had been crying. Her cheeks were still wet. She had not been sent. She had run away from her nurse to find me. He said, "You see everything." She said, "I see what no one else looks at. There is a difference." He said, after a long moment, "May I sit?" She said, "Sire, this is your house." He said, "Maeve, I am asking." She let him in. He sat on the chair by the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. He did not look at her in a way that made her afraid. He looked at her in a way she did not know what to do with, because she had no word for it, because she could not scent him, because the only word she had for what was on his face was a word she had never been allowed to use. He said, "My cousin is going to try to kill the horse." Maeve said, "I know." He said, "How?" She said, "Because horses are easier to kill than girls, and he wants me discredited, and he wants the council ride to find a corpse." He said, "Garrick will sit the stable from midnight to dawn for the next 10 nights. She said, "Thank you, sire." He said, "Torvin." She said nothing. He said, "When we are alone, Torvin." She said, very softly, "Torvin." He closed his eyes. He said, "I cannot tell whether you can feel this, whatever this is, between us. I cannot tell. You do not look at me the way the others do. I have never in my life been with a woman who could not feel me coming into a room. I do not know what to do with it. Maid said, with her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. I cannot feel it, my lord. I have never felt anything from any wolf. I am sorry. I know that means there cannot be a bond. I know what you are. I would not embarrass either of us by pretending. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and the wolf inside him stood up on its hind legs and howled. But he did not let her see it, because she could not see it, because that was the whole problem, because he was going to have to learn an entirely new language to court her. He said, "Then we will find another way." He stood. He did not touch her. He went back through the door and bolted it on his side, for her honor and for the watching servants. And on her side, she sat on the bed and pressed both her hands to her mouth and did not weep, because she had not wept in 7 years, but it was a near thing. He courted her in a language she had to teach him as he learned it. He could not bring her his scent across a room. He could not stand close and let her feel the heat of him and the prickle of pack presence, the way every other wolf wooed every other wolf. He had to bring her, instead, things she could see and touch and hear. He brought her a wool shawl on the 7th day, when the upper pasture had begun to crust with real ice. And he did not give it to her himself. He had Garrick lay it across the half-door of Vasker's box, where she would find it on her dawn round, with no note, because a note from a king to a scullery girl was a thing the keep could weaponize. She found the shawl. She knew immediately who it was from. She wore it. She walked Vasker in it. The king, watching from the gallery, saw her wearing it, and the wolf inside him purred. He brought her, on the 9th day, a small carved wooden horse, no bigger than her thumb, with a tiny notch in the ear where Vasker had a tiny notch in the ear, and he set it on the windowsill of the war room where the sun struck it, at the hour she was always passing through. She passed through. She stopped. She picked it up. She put it in her pocket, and she put her hand in her pocket all the rest of the day to feel it. And the king, in council, kept losing the thread of what his lords were saying, because he could feel, through the whole stronghold, the small warm fact of a girl with her hand around a wooden horse. He brought her, on the 11th day, the child Katie, every afternoon for an hour, for what he called her tutoring, which was in fact only sitting in the straw with Maeve and with Brindle and with Vasker, the 4 of them in a row, the child telling Maeve every secret she had ever held, and Maeve listening as if every secret were the most important secret ever told. He brought her on the 13th day, his own self. He came down to the stable at dusk. He did not speak. He sat beside her on the straw bale outside Vasker's box. He laid his hand, palm up, on the bale between them. He did not look at her. He waited. Maeve, after a long moment, put her hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, very slowly, the way a man closes his fingers around a moth he does not want to crush. They sat that way for an hour. Neither of them spoke. He did not try to kiss her. He did not lean. He held her hand. When the bell for the evening meal rang, he lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, once, very gently, and let her go, and walked out. And Maeve sat on the straw bale alone for a long time afterwards, holding her own hand as if it had been changed. On the 15th day, the council ride was 8 days off. On the 15th day, Garrick came to her at dawn with his face the color of bad cheese and said, "Girl, the bran mash for tonight has been touched." She went with him to the feed room. She did not need to scent it. She could see it. The bran mash had a faintly oily cast at the edges of the bucket, and there was a small dust of yellow-green at the rim, and a barn cat that had jumped up to investigate had jumped down again and gone to vomit in the corner. "Wolfsbane," Garrick said quietly. Enough for him. Enough for any horse who ate it. Maeve said, "Is the cat dying?" Garrick said, "She only licked. She will live." Maeve crouched by the cat and put her hand on her back and felt the scrape of the poison along the cat's nerves and breathed with her, slow and slow, until the cat blinked and curled up to sleep. Garrick said, "How did they get past my watch?" Maeve said, "They did not. They sent it through the feed wagon at the noon delivery. Whoever did it was not in the stable last night. Whoever did it was in the kitchens at noon, near the wagon, with a pocket and a steady hand." Garrick said, "Pell." She said yes. Garrick said, "And Pell takes orders from—" She said, "Yes." Garrick said, "We need proof." She said, "We have a witness." Garrick said, "A horse is not a witness." She said, "Then we will give him a voice." They went to the king. They told him. He listened with his hands flat on the war table, and he did not interrupt. And when they were done, he said, "Garrick, the council ride happens as planned. Castaigne rides at my left as cousin regent. Vasker is the horse I ride." Garrick made a noise. Torvin said, "I trust this girl with my brother's horse. I trust this girl with my brother's child. I trust this girl with my own throat." He looked at Maeve. "Do not tell me yet," he said, "that I am wrong." Maeve, who could not scent him, who could not feel his wolf, who had only the carved horse in her pocket and the memory of his mouth on her knuckles to go on, said, "You are not wrong, Torvin." He said, "Then we ride." The night before the council ride, he came to her chamber and did not knock. He opened the door between the war room and her chamber, and he stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind him, and he said, "Maeve." She had been sitting on the bed in her shift, plaiting her hair for sleep. She did not cover herself. She had nothing to cover. He had seen her every day for a moon cycle, and she had no scent for him to hide behind, and so she did not bother to hide her body either. She said, "Torvin." He came in. He shut the door behind him. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He took the end of her plate out of her hand and finished it himself, with fingers that were not as clumsy as a king's fingers should have been, and he tied it off with the leather thong she had laid on the coverlet, and then he laid his palm against the side of her throat, where the rejection mark was, and he kept it there, warm. He said, "If I die tomorrow." She said, "You will not." He said, "If I die tomorrow, I want you to know." He stopped. He did not have the words. He had been raised among wolves, who courted with scent and pack pressure and the silent shapes of things. And he had only the words other people had given him, and they were not enough. He said, the way a man says a vow at an altar, "I love you." Maeve, who had not been told this in her life, who could not scent the truth of it, who had only the shape of his face in lamplight and the warmth of his palm on her throat to judge by, said, "How do I know?" He went very still. She said, with her eyes on his, "I am not asking to wound you. I am asking because I cannot scent you, and you know I cannot scent you, and I do not have the thing other women have to tell them. So I am asking, how do I know?" He thought about it. He thought for a long time, while his hand stayed on her throat and her plate lay across her shoulder and the candle guttered. Then he stood up and he went to the door and he opened it and he whistled, low and short. The sound of small claws on stone. The fat puppy Brindle came waddling in. Behind him came Vasker, who should not have been in the keep at all, who had been led up the servant's stair by Garrick himself, who filled the doorway of her bedchamber like a second night, who put his great head down and walked across the rug and laid his muzzle in her lap. Behind Vasker came the child Katie, in her sleeping shift, holding the hand of cook Sharon, who was weeping. The king stood in the doorway of her chamber, and he gestured at all of them. He said, "You asked how you know. Ask them." Maeve, who could read animal grief the way pack-trained healers read wounds, who could read animal love the same way, put her hand on Vasker's muzzle, on Brindle's head, on the child's hair, and she felt the truth of him through every one of them. The horse who had refused all human touch for 11 months had let this man weep into his forelock. The puppy, who feared every boot, leaned into this man's boot. The child, who had lost her father, slept easy in this man's keep. Cook Sharon, who had no reason on earth to weep for a king, was weeping because a girl she had raised in her kitchen was being chosen, openly, in front of witnesses, and the kitchen knew what the high table did not, which was that Maeve had never been broken, only differently made. Maeve looked up at Torvin. She said very quietly, "I know." He crossed the room. He knelt at the side of the bed. He did not kiss her yet. He said, "Will you let me?" She said, "Yes." He kissed her. It was not a king's kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had spent 11 months being careful and had found, finally, something he did not have to be careful with. It was interrupted in the end, not by treachery, but by Vasker, who, having decided he had been still for long enough, lifted his great head and bumped Torvin so hard in the shoulder that the king rocked sideways, and the child Katie laughed a small, startled laugh, and cook Sharon made a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh, and Maeve, with her hands in Torvin's hair, laughed too, because the moment was too full of living things to be solemn. He drew back. He pressed his forehead to hers. He said, "Tomorrow, after the ride, after Castaigne." He said, "I will come back to you." And then, because he was a careful man, and because she was a careful woman, and because the keep had ears, they parted, and he led the impossible parade of his witnesses back down the servants' stair. And Maeve lay alone in the dark, and put her hand on the place on her throat where his hand had been, and did not sleep, but did not need to. The council ride went out at mid-morning, 12 riders, the king at the head on Vasker, Castaigne at his left on a pale gray, Garrick at his right on a bay. The rest of the council strung out behind in their colors. The day was cold and bright. The crowd in the courtyard was triple what it should have been, because the keep had heard rumors. The keep always heard rumors, and the keep wanted to see whether the king's mad horse would throw him. Maeve stood at the gate with the child Katie on her hip and Brindle on a lead, and cook Sharon at her shoulder. She watched Vasker go out under the king. She watched the great muscled flank of him, the careful, steady walk, the way he kept one ear cocked back to Torvin the entire time, and she knew, because she always knew, that the horse was holding his grief to one side because his man had asked him to. They would ride the perimeter of the council lands. They would stop, by tradition, at the standing stones above the river, where the kings of Ironfang were judged by their council in open air. They would ride back. It was a thing of ceremony. It was a thing that, in the ordinary run of years, ended with a feast. Maeve, who could not scent any wolf, who had no thread or hum or pull to tell her when her chosen was in danger, knew within the first hour that something was wrong, because Brindle, on his lead, would not stop whining. She knelt to him. He was looking at the gate. He was looking at the road. She lifted her face and she said, "Sharon." Sharon said, "Aye, lass." Maeve said, "Saddle me anything, anything, the mule, the bread cart pony, anything." Sharon, who was not a fool, did not ask. They saddled the bread cart pony, which was a stout, fat creature called Bun, and Maeve, in her green wool dress, swung up onto Bun astride, and the child Katie said, "I am coming," and Maeve said, "You are not," and handed her to Sharon, and Sharon, weeping again, took the child and stood back, and Maeve rode out of Ironfang at a flat gallop on a bread cart pony, with Brindle running yelping at her heels until he could not keep up, and a stable boy snatched him up and ran after on foot. She caught the column at the standing stones. She saw, before they saw her, what Brindle had told her without words. The council was off their horses. The king was off his horse. They were ringed around a thing on the ground. Castaigne was standing at the edge of the ring. His face was arranged in grief. The thing on the ground was Garrick. He had been struck from behind, with what looked like a fall from his horse. But Maeve, even from 100 yards away on a fat pony, could see that the angle was wrong. That a man does not fall from a bay horse and land that way. That the bay horse was standing too quietly, with too clean a flank. That the only blood in the scene was on the back of Garrick's head, and on Castaigne's left sleeve. She rode into the ring. She did not dismount. She said, from the back of Bun the bread cart pony, in a voice that was not the voice of a scullery girl, "Lord Regent Castaigne struck Beta Master Garrick from behind with the pommel of his own dagger 6 minutes ago." She said, "He intended to blame the king's horse. He intended to say Vasker threw a hoof and broke the Beta Master's skull." She said, "The dagger is in his left sleeve. The blood on his sleeve is Garrick's." She said, "And I will offer you, my lords, 3 witnesses." She slid down off Bun. The stable boy, panting, arrived behind her with Brindle in his arms. Brindle sat down, ran, not to Maeve, but to Castaigne, and bared his small puppy teeth and growled at Castaigne's left boot, and would not be moved. Vasker, behind the king, lifted his head and screamed, the way he had screamed in the corpse pit, the way only a horse who had smelled the killer of his rider could scream, and lunged, not at the king, not at Garrick, but at Castaigne, and the king, who had been ready, threw his arm across Vasker's chest and held him, barely, and said, "Cousin, empty your sleeve." Castaigne said, "This is absurd." He said, "A child's puppy and a mad horse and a scullery." Torvin said, "Empty your sleeve." Castaigne ran. He ran for his pale gray, which was being held by his man Pell, and Pell, seeing what was happening, dropped the reins and ran the other way, and the pale gray, who had been taught no loyalty because Castaigne had taught nothing loyalty, walked off to crop grass, and Castaigne, in his fine boots, stumbled across the broken ground of the standing stones, with the council shouting behind him. He made it as far as the river edge. The river at the standing stones ran fast and cold over flat slabs of granite. Castaigne, looking back over his shoulder at the king and the horse and the girl, did not see the slab. He hit it with his right boot. The dagger, loose in his left sleeve, swung as he fell. The dagger's pommel, weighted as it was for a striking blow, drove down under his own ribs as he came down on the stone. He did not get up. The river took the rest. He was found, by Garrick himself, who had not in fact died, 2 bends downstream, with his own blade through his own chest and his polished smile gone. The council, standing at the stones, looked from the river to the girl on the bread cart pony and the puppy at her feet, and the great black horse with his head now pressed to the king's shoulder. The eldest counselor, who had served 3 kings, said, "Sire, I believe we have ridden long enough." Torvin, with his hand on Vasker's neck and his eyes on Maeve, said, "Aye, let us go home." The wedding was at the next moon. It was not at the high altar with the council watching. It was in the upper pasture, with the frost just gone and the first green coming through. And Cook Sharon officiated because Maeve had said she wanted. no priest who had ever called her broken to bless her now. And Torvin had said yes, the way he said yes to her about everything. And the council had had the sense not to argue. The vows were short. He said, "I take you." She said, "I take you." He bit her, very gently, at the join of her neck and shoulder, the formal mark of the Alpha King's claim, and she did not feel the bond settle the way other women felt it, because she could not. But she felt his teeth, and his breath, and his hand at the small of her back, and she felt, through Vasker standing behind them, and through Brindle sitting at their feet, and through the child Katie holding the ribbon, and through Cook Sharon weeping into her apron, the absolute fact of being chosen. And that was enough, and would always be enough. And Torvin, who had learned in one moon cycle to court without scent, knew this without being told. They lived. There is a thing about these stories where the living gets skipped, and I will not skip it for you. They lived through the spring of replanting the council because Castaigne had had fingers in many pots, and many pots had to be scrubbed. They lived through the summer of Vasker, learning to be ridden again by other riders, because the king could not always ride him, and the horse, having grieved openly at last, had room in his great chest for new affections. They lived through the autumn when Garrick, who had survived the blow with a thick skull and a thicker grudge, married Cook Sharon in the kitchen yard, which surprised no one who had watched them argue across a stew pot for 15 years. They lived through the winter when the child Katie, now 7, declared that she was going to be a horse listener like her Aunt Maeve when she grew up, and Maeve, hearing herself called Aunt for the first time, sat down on the kitchen step and put her face in her apron for a long moment before she could answer. "Yes, my heart, you are." They lived through a second spring, and on a morning in that second spring, in the upper pasture where the frost had again just gone, Maeve stood with her hand on Vasker's muzzle and her other hand low on her own belly, where a thing was beginning that she did not yet know the shape of, but that the horse, with his nose against her dress, very clearly did. Torvin came up the pasture in his shirt sleeves with 2 cups of tea. He saw her standing there with the horse. He saw where her hand was. He stopped, halfway up the pasture, with the tea in both hands, and his face did a thing she had learned over the year, to read as well as any scent. She said across the grass, "You knew before I did." He said, "The wolf knew." He said, "The wolf has known for 3 days." He said, "I was waiting for you to tell me, because I did not want to take it from you." She said, "Come here, you ridiculous man." He came. He set the tea down on a stone. He put his hand over hers on her belly, and he put his forehead against hers, and Vasker, on her other side, blew a long, warm breath across both of them, and Brindle, who was now an enormous fat hound with a gray muzzle, lay down on her foot, and the child Katie, coming up the path with a basket, shrieked at the top of her lungs because she had guessed. And the upper pasture, on that morning, in that second spring, contained every single thing Maeve had ever been told, in 7 years of being broken, that she could not have. She had it anyway. She had it because a horse in a corpse pit had laid his head in her hand and named her, in a language only she could hear, as the one who heard. She had it because a king had learned, in one moon cycle, to court a woman who could not scent him, by bringing her instead every living thing in his keep, until she had been forced to admit that any man loved by that many creatures could not be anything but loved by her, too. She had it because, when the standard test of the bond had been taken from her, another test had been offered, and that test had been the harder one, and she had passed it, and so had he. So, there you are, my friends. That was Maeve of Ironfang, the rejected Omega who could not scent a wolf, and Torvin, the king, who learned a new way to love. If this story moved you, even a little, tell me, on a scale from 1 to 10, where it landed in your chest. Drop the number. Tell me which moment you would have given an 11 for. And if you want more stories like this one, stories where the heroine the world calls broken turns out to have been the only one in the room who could hear the truth, then stay with me. Subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell. I have more of these to tell you, and I will be telling them, one moon cycle at a time, for as long as you will listen.